Gilded Chains. Valeria Marchesi had been raised in silk and gold, meant to be nothing more than a political pawn. But when her brother betrayed the wrong family, her life was signed away in blood. Niccolò Moretti, the most feared capo in Sicily, leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Your father traded your life for his own," he murmured. "I wonder if you'll be worth the price." Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage Shatters. The clink of the Limoges teacup against its saucer was the last civilized sound Valeria Marchesi heard before her world fractured. She'd been sitting in the sun-drenched conservatory of their Palermo villa, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air, meticulously painting a watercolor of the bougainvillea that cascaded down the terracotta walls. Her life, up until that moment, had been a carefully curated masterpiece of privilege and expectation. Silk dresses, private tutors, the finest wines, and the looming expectation of a strategic marriage to solidify the Marchesi family's position. She was 57, yet felt, in many ways, like a child still playing at being a woman. Her first marriage, to a man twice her age, had been a bloodless affair, ending with his convenient death 10 years prior. She'd mourned the loss of security, not love. Now, her brother, Lorenzo, stood before her, his face ashen, the usual arrogance replaced by a tremor that spoke of profound fear. "Valeria," he began, his voice hoarse, "there's been a complication." Complication. Such a bland word for the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Lorenzo, the heir to their father's vast and questionably acquired fortune, had always been reckless. Gambling, fast cars, faster women. He'd always been shielded by their father's influence, his mistakes swept under the rug like dust in a palace too grand to ever truly be clean. "What have you done, Lorenzo?" Valeria asked, her voice steady despite the sudden, icy dread pooling in her stomach. She set down her brush, the delicate bristles staining the pristine white of her linen dress. A small, insignificant imperfection, a precursor to the much larger stain that was about to mar her life. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He paced, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, a frantic rhythm to his guilt. I owed money. A significant amount. To the wrong people. The wrong people. In Palermo, that could only mean one thing. The Mafia. Not the romanticized Hollywood version, but the real, brutal, insidious power that controlled the city, a shadow government operating with its own ancient laws and ruthless punishments. To whom? Lorenzo? Valeria pressed, her voice sharper now, the fear giving way to a cold, hard anger. He finally stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The Moretti family. The name struck her like a physical blow. The Moretti. Not just any mafia family, but the most powerful, the most feared, in all of Sicily. Led by Niccolò Moretti, a man whispered about in hushed tones, a man whose reputation was as dark and impenetrable as the volcanic rock of Etna. A man known for his chilling calm, his unwavering ruthlessness, and his absolute adherence to the ancient code of honor that governed his world. And? Valeria prompted, knowing that Lorenzo's confession was far from over. He swallowed hard, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. "I couldn't pay. They demanded a price. Father tried to negotiate, to offer them more money, land, businesses. But they refused." Valeria stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She walked towards the open doors of the conservatory, the warm Sicilian breeze doing little to soothe the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She looked out at the meticulously manicured gardens, the sparkling blue of the Mediterranean beyond, the illusion of paradise now shattered. "What price, Lorenzo?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper, already knowing the answer. He finally met her eyes, his gaze filled with a mixture of shame and a desperate plea for understanding. "You, Valeria. They demanded you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She gripped the edge of the wrought iron table, her knuckles white, the delicate porcelain teacup shattering on the floor, a final, discordant note to the symphony of her former life. Her. A woman of 57, a widow, a painter, A woman who had lived her entire life within the confines of gilded expectations was now being traded like a piece of property, a pawn in a deadly game she didn't understand. Lorenzo rushed to her side, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her. "Valeria, I'm so sorry. Father tried everything, but they wouldn't budge. It was the only way to save the family, to save me. Save the family. Save himself." The words echoed in the shattered remains of her world. Family. The very concept that had defined her, confined her, was now betraying her. She had been raised to believe in family loyalty above all else, to sacrifice everything for the Marchesi name. And now, that loyalty was demanding the ultimate sacrifice. She straightened her back, the years of ingrained composure rising to the surface, masking the turmoil within. "When?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Tomorrow. They're sending someone to collect you tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours to pack a lifetime, to say goodbye to everything she had ever known, to prepare herself for a future she couldn't even begin to imagine. A future in the hands of Niccolò Moretti. She turned back to Lorenzo, her eyes devoid of emotion. "Leave me," she said, her voice cold and distant. He hesitated, then obeyed, his footsteps retreating, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her life. Valeria walked to the shattered teacup, picking up a single, delicate shard. She pressed it against her finger, a tiny pinprick of pain, a tangible reminder of the reality that had just crashed down upon her. A single drop of blood welled up, crimson against the white porcelain, a symbol of the blood vow that now bound her to a destiny she had never chosen. The scent of jasmine, once a comfort, now seemed cloying, suffocating. She looked out at the vibrant bougainvillea, its beauty now a cruel mockery of the freedom she had lost. The gilded cage had shattered, but the world outside was far more dangerous, far more terrifying than anything she could have ever imagined. And she was utterly alone, facing a future as uncertain and as menacing as the shadows that were already beginning to lengthen across the sun-drenched conservatory. The question was, would she simply wilt in their darkness, or find an unexpected strength within the heart of the storm? Chapter 2. Shadows of the Moretti estate. The car, a sleek black Alfa Romeo, wound its way through the rugged Sicilian countryside. Valeria sat in the back, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, a blur of olive groves, vineyards, and ancient stone farmhouses. She hadn't slept, spending the night packing a single suitcase, filled not with the silks and jewels of her former life, but with practical clothes, her painting supplies, and a few cherished photographs her parents, a younger, carefree Lorenzo, and one of herself, taken years ago. A faint smile playing on her lips, a woman she no longer recognized. The driver, a taciturn man named Marco, hadn't spoken a word since picking her up, his silence adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional sigh that escaped Valeria's lips, each one a testament to the weight of her apprehension. She tried to find out more about Niccolò Moretti, but the internet yielded little beyond the obvious his status as head of the Moretti family, his vast wealth, and the vague, unsettling rumors of his ruthlessness. There were no pictures, no personal details, only a shadow of a man, a figure of power and fear. As they approached the Moretti estate, the landscape changed. The rolling hills gave way to a dramatic coastline, the deep blue of the Tyrrhenian Sea crashing against jagged cliffs. The villa itself was perched atop one of these cliffs, a sprawling, imposing structure of ancient stone, its walls seemingly rising directly from the rock face. It was beautiful, in a stark, forbidding way, a fortress against the world, a reflection of the man who ruled it. The car passed through massive wrought iron gates, adorned with the Moretti family crest, a stylized serpent coiled around a sword, a symbol of power, cunning, and danger. The driveway was long and winding, lined with cypress trees that stood like silent sentinels, their dark shadows stretching across the manicured lawns. Valeria felt a sense of claustrophobia, a feeling of being watched, scrutinized, judged. The car stopped in front of a massive wooden door, carved with intricate scenes of mythical battles. Marco got out and opened the door for her, his expression unreadable. Valeria stepped out, her legs slightly unsteady, and took a deep breath, the salty sea air filling her lungs. She smoothed down the wrinkles in her simple gray dress, a futile attempt to regain some semblance of composure. The door opened, revealing a vast entrance hall, dimly lit by flickering candles in ornate sconces. The air was cool and heavy, scented with a faint aroma of beeswax and something else, something indefinable, something that hinted at age and power. A woman, tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, stood waiting for her. Her face was unlined, her eyes sharp and intelligent, her expression as carefully controlled as the perfectly tailored black dress she wore. "Signora Marchesi," she said, her voice smooth and cultured, "I am Isabella, the housekeeper. Don Niccolo is expecting you." Valeria nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She followed Isabella through the labyrinthine corridors of the villa, the silence broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the marble floors. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced men and women, the ancestors of the Moretti family, their eyes seeming to follow her, judging her, assessing her worth. They stopped before a pair of massive oak doors, even more imposing than the entrance. Isabella knocked softly, then opened one of the doors, revealing a large, dimly lit study. The room was dominated by a massive desk made of dark wood, behind which sat Niccolo Moretti. He stood up as Valeria entered, and she finally saw him, the man who held her fate in his hands. He was taller than she expected, his presence filling the room. He was not conventionally handsome, but his face held a raw, compelling power. His eyes, a dark, almost black, brown, were intense and penetrating, seeming to see straight through her. His hair was thick and dark, streaked with silver at the temples, adding to his aura of authority. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, but it was the way he wore it, with an effortless elegance, that spoke of his power. There was a scar, a thin white line, that ran across his left cheek, a silent testament to a past filled with violence and danger. "Valeria Marchesi," he said, his voice a low rumble, a sound that resonated deep within her. He didn't offer a greeting, no polite formalities, just her name, spoken like an accusation, a judgment. "Don Niccolo," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, meeting his gaze without flinching. He gestured towards a chair in front of the desk. "Seat." Valeria sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, the tension in the room palpable. He studied her, his gaze unwavering, assessing her, weighing her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a specimen under a microscope. Finally, he spoke. "Your brother is a fool," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And your father is a weakling. They offered you as payment for a debt of honor." Valeria flinched at his bluntness, but she didn't look away. "I am aware of the circumstances, Don Niccolo. Do you understand the implications?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You are now bound to me, to this family. Your life is no longer your own." "I understand that I am here because of my family's actions," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "I also understand that I have no choice in the matter." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or even respect crossed his face. "You are not what I expected," he said, his voice softening slightly. "And what did you expect, Don Niccolo?" Valeria asked, a hint of defiance in her voice. "A weeping, hysterical woman, begging for your mercy?" He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps," he admitted. "But you are stronger than you appear. That is interesting." He stood up and walked towards a window that overlooked the sea. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room, painting the sky in shades of orange, purple, and blood red. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, his silence adding to the unsettling atmosphere. "Your brother's debt is paid," he said finally, his voice echoing in the stillness. "But that does not mean you are free. You are here under my protection, under my control. You will obey my rules, you will respect my family, and you will learn to live within the confines of this world. Valeria watched him, her mind racing. She was a prisoner, yes, but perhaps not in the way she had initially feared. There was something in his gaze, something in his voice, that hinted at something more than just cold, calculated power. There was a complexity, a depth, that she couldn't quite decipher. "And what if I refuse?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. He turned back to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Then you will face the consequences," he said simply. "But I don't think you will refuse, Valeria Marchesi. I think you are a survivor. And I think you are about to discover that survival in this world requires more than just obedience. It requires strength, courage, and a willingness to embrace the shadows." He walked back to his desk and sat down, his gaze locking with hers. "You will have your own rooms, of course. Isabella will show you. Dinner is at 8. Do not be late." The dismissal was clear, the conversation over. Yet, as Valeria rose to leave, she knew this was merely the beginning of a much longer, more complex, and potentially dangerous dance. The shadows of the Moretti estate had enveloped her, and she had a feeling that escaping them would be far more difficult than she could have ever imagined. The question that lingered, however, was whether she truly wanted to escape, or if a part of her, long dormant, was drawn to the very darkness that threatened to consume her. Chapter 3. Whispers of a Hidden Past. The room Isabella led her to was surprisingly spacious and elegant. Unlike the austere grandeur of the rest of the villa, it possessed a softer, more feminine touch. The walls were painted a pale cream, and the furniture was antique, but comfortable. A large four-poster bed draped with silk, a writing desk overlooking the sea, a comfortable armchair beside a fireplace. There were fresh flowers on the table, their fragrance a welcome contrast to the heavier scents of the rest of the house. "Don Nicolò instructed me to make you as comfortable as possible," Isabella said, her voice neutral, her expression giving nothing away. "He may be demanding, but he is not cruel." Valeria managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Isabella." Isabella nodded, her gaze lingering on Valeria for a moment, a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. "If you need anything, you need only ring," she said, gesturing towards a small bell on the bedside table. "Dinner is at 8, as Don Nicolò said. It is customary to dress formally." With that, Isabella left, closing the door softly behind her. Valeria sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the day settle upon her. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but sleep seemed impossible. She unpacked her meager belongings, placing her painting supplies on the writing desk, the familiar sight of them a small comfort in this strange, unsettling environment. She looked out the window, the vast expanse of the sea stretching before her, the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The view was breathtaking, but it also filled her with a sense of isolation. She was trapped, not just within the walls of the Moretti estate, but within a world she didn't understand, a world of secrets and shadows. She decided to explore the room, hoping to find something, anything, that might offer a clue to the man who now controlled her life. She opened the drawers of the writing desk, finding them empty except for a few sheets of blank paper and a single, antique pen. She opened the wardrobe, finding it stocked with clothes, not the simple dresses she had brought with her, but elegant gowns, silk blouses, and tailored trousers, all in muted colors, all clearly chosen with her in mind. In the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, she found a small, locked box. It was made of dark wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and it felt heavy in her hands. She tried to open it, but it was locked, the key nowhere to be found. She considered asking Isabella about it, but something held her back. A feeling that this box and its contents were meant to remain secret, at least for now. She returned the box to its hiding place and went to the window again. The setting sun was painting long shadows across the room. She looked out over the view and suddenly, for a second, thought she saw a flicker of movement down by the cliffs. She focused and there, partially obscured, a figure. It was a man, and from the set of his shoulders and build, it seemed that it was Nicolò. He was standing on the rocks. The sea was unusually active, tossing white crests of foam around and high up his legs. She spent the remaining time before dinner sketching in her pad, the rough charcoal outlines of Nicolo and the rough sea filling page after page. It helped to pass the time and to stop the thoughts that kept buzzing inside her head. When the time came, Valeria changed into one of the dresses she had found in the wardrobe, a simple but elegant black gown that fit her perfectly. She brushed her hair, leaving it loose around her shoulders, and added a touch of lipstick, her only concession to vanity. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing a woman she barely recognized. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with something else, a flicker of defiance, a spark of determination. She made her way to the dining room, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was large and opulent, lit by a massive crystal chandelier that cast a dazzling light on the polished mahogany table. Nicolo was already there, standing by the fireplace, a glass of red wine in his hand. He turned as she entered, his eyes taking in her appearance, a flicker of something that might have been approval in his gaze. "You look appropriate," he said, his voice neutral. Valeria inclined her head, refusing to be intimidated. "Thank you, Don Nicolo." He gestured towards a table, which was set for two. "Please sit." The meal was a silent affair, the only sounds the clink of silverware against china and the occasional murmur of the servants as they served the various courses. The food was exquisite, a testament to the Moretti family's wealth and taste, but Valeria had little appetite. She picked at her food, her mind racing, trying to decipher the man who sat across from her. He ate with a quiet elegance, his movements precise and controlled. He didn't speak, but she could feel his gaze on her, studying her, assessing her. The silence was oppressive, but she refused to break it, determined to match his composure. As the servants cleared the plates from the main course, Nicolo finally spoke. "Tell me about yourself, Valeria," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Tell me about the woman who paints and prefers watercolors." Valeria hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "There is not much to tell," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I lived a quiet life, a sheltered life. My days were filled with domestic pursuits." "And your marriage?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Was it a happy one?" Valeria looked down at her hands, the memory of her late husband a distant, faded image. "It was convenient," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He was a good man, but we were not in love." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "And did you ever want children?" The question caught her off guard. It was a question she hadn't allowed herself to consider for many years. I did. Once, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But it was not meant to be." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Fate can be cruel," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But it can also be surprising." He swirled the wine in his glass, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. "This family," he said, his voice low and intense, "has a long and complicated history. A history filled with blood, betrayal, and secrets." He looked up at her, his eyes dark and piercing. "There are things you do not know, Valeria, things that are not spoken of, things that are buried deep within the walls of this villa." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, the silence stretching between them. "There are whispers," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "of a curse, of a betrayal that spans generations, of a secret that could destroy everything." Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. The words were vague, unsettling, but they resonated with a deep, primal fear. She had a feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to be plunged into a darkness she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The whispers of a hidden past were all around her, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that those whispers were about to become a roar. And that roar, she suspected, would change everything. The gentle sea breeze, now a fierce wind, rattled the old windows of the villa. Chapter 4. The Weight of a Blood Oath. The following days settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Valeria spent her mornings painting, finding solace in the familiar act of creating, of translating the beauty of the Sicilian landscape onto canvas. She explored the gardens, discovering hidden pathways, secluded fountains, and ancient statues that seemed to whisper secrets of the past. She avoided Niccolò as much as possible, feeling his presence like a weight, a constant reminder of her precarious situation. The evenings, however, were unavoidable. Dinner was always a formal affair, a silent ritual played out under the watchful eyes of the ancestors in the portraits on the walls. Niccolò rarely spoke during these meals, but his presence dominated the room, his silence as powerful as any words. He was a puzzle, an enigma, a man shrouded in mystery and power. She found herself studying him, trying to decipher the man behind the mask, the man behind the title of Don. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Niccolò surprised her by inviting her to his study. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but she knew she couldn't refuse. She followed him through the dimly lit corridors, the silence amplifying her apprehension. His study, as always, was a reflection of the man himself, austere, elegant, and filled with an unspoken power. He gestured towards a chair, and she sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He stood by the window, looking out at the night sky, the moon casting long shadows across the room. "You are adapting well," he said, his voice low and resonant, breaking the silence. Valeria inclined her head, unsure how to respond. "I am trying to make the best of my situation," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. He turned to face her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "This situation, as you call it, is not temporary, Valeria," he said, his voice firm. "You are bound to me, to this family, by a blood oath. Do you understand the weight of that oath?" Valeria met his gaze, without flinching. "I understand that my life is no longer my own," she said, her voice steady. "But I do not understand the purpose of it all. Why me? Why not simply demand more money, more land?" He walked towards her, his presence filling the room, his shadow falling across her. "Because money and land are fleeting," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Loyalty, family, those are the things that endure. And sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from wealth, but from connection." He stopped in front of her, his gaze locking with hers. "Your family has a history with mine, Valeria," he said, his voice softening slightly. "A history that goes back generations. A history filled with animosity, betrayal, and a debt that has never been fully repaid." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Valeria flinched at his touch, but she didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the coldness of his words. "There was a woman," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "many years ago. A woman who was promised to my grandfather, a woman who broke her vow, a woman who brought shame and dishonor upon our family." He removed his hand, his gaze drifting towards the fireplace, where a fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Her name was also Valeria," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of bitterness and regret. "And you, Valeria Marchesi, bear a striking resemblance to her, not just in appearance but in spirit." Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. The whispers of the past were growing louder, the shadows were deepening. She was beginning to understand that her presence in the Moretti household was not just a random act of cruelty, but a deliberate, calculated move, a piece in a much larger, more complex game. A game that spanned generations, a game of revenge, retribution, and perhaps something more. "I am not her," Valeria said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I am not responsible for the sins of the past." He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. "Perhaps not," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But you're a reminder of a debt that must be repaid, a reminder of a wound that has never healed." He turned away from her and walked back to his desk, his movements stiff and controlled. "You will learn more in time," he said, his voice dismissing her. "But for now, know this. You are here for a reason, Valeria. And that reason will become clear, eventually." Valeria stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She left the study, her mind reeling, the weight of the blood oath pressing down on her. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a game that had been playing out long before she was born. But she was also a woman of strength, a woman of resilience, and she was determined to survive, to unravel the secrets of the past, and to find her own place in this new, dangerous world. She had a feeling that the key to her survival, and perhaps even her happiness, lay in understanding the man who held her captive, the man who was both her jailer and, increasingly, the object of a fascination she couldn't quite explain. The fire in the grate had died down to glowing embers, mirroring the uncertain, dangerous spark that was beginning to ignite between them. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed the turmoil within her heart. Chapter 5. Echoes of Rebellion and Regret. The next morning, Valeria awoke to the sound of rain lashing against the windows. The storm that had been brewing the previous night had arrived in full force, mirroring the turmoil within her. She felt restless, uneasy, the conversation with Nicolo weighing heavily on her mind. She decided to forego her usual morning painting and instead explore the villa. She had been confined to her room and the main living areas, but she knew there were other parts of the house, older parts, that she hadn't yet seen. She dressed in a simple sweater and trousers and ventured out into the labyrinthine corridors. She wandered through silent hallways, passing closed doors, each one a mystery, a potential source of secrets. She found a library, filled with ancient books bound in leather, their pages filled with the history of the Moretti family, a history she was now inextricably linked to. She spent hours there, poring over dusty volumes, trying to piece together the puzzle of the past, the story of the woman who shared her name, the woman who had betrayed Nicolo's grandfather. The more she read, the more she realized that the story was far more complex than Nicolo had let on. There were conflicting accounts, whispers of forbidden love, of a power struggle between families, of a woman caught in the middle, forced to make an impossible choice. The Valeria of the past was not simply a villain, but a tragic figure, a woman who had dared to defy the rigid rules of her society, a woman who had paid the ultimate price for her rebellion. As Valeria delved deeper into the past, she began to feel a connection to this woman, a sense of empathy, a recognition of a kindred spirit. She, too, had been forced to make choices, to sacrifice her own desires for the sake of her family. She, too, was trapped in a world of rigid expectations, a world where women were often treated as pawns, their lives dictated by the whims of men. In the late afternoon, she found herself, by a twist of curious fate, in a wing of the villa she was sure she had never been in before. The air here was colder and smelled faintly of dust and disuse. At the end of a long corridor, she found a room with its door slightly ajar. She pushed it open cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was a studio, filled with art supplies, canvases, easels, brushes, paints. But unlike her own pristine studio, this one was clearly unused, covered in a thick layer of dust. There were unfinished paintings on the easels, portraits of men and women, their faces frozen in time, their eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, sadness, anger, regret. Valeria recognized the style immediately. It was the same style as the portraits that hung in the dining room, the portraits of the Moretti ancestors. This was the studio of the family artist, the person who had chronicled the lives of the Moretti clan for generations. She walked around the room, examining the paintings, the brushes, the palettes, feeling a sense of connection to the artist who had once worked here, a fellow creator, a fellow chronicler of lives. She noticed a small, wooden box on a table, similar to the one she had found in her own room. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, and opened it. Inside, she found a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were written in Italian, in a delicate, flowing script. She recognized the handwriting. It was the same handwriting as in some of the books she had read in the library, the handwriting of the Valeria of the past. She sat down in a dusty armchair and began to read. The letters were addressed to a man named Alessandro, a man who was clearly Valeria's lover, the man she had chosen over Nicolo's grandfather. The letters were filled with passion, with longing, with a desperate plea for understanding. They told a story of forbidden love, of a woman torn between her duty to her family and her desire for happiness. As Valeria read the letters, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. She understood, now, the true weight of the blood oath, the true tragedy of the past. The Valeria of the past had not been a villain, but a victim, a woman who had been punished for daring to love the wrong man. And as she sat there, in the dusty studio, surrounded by the echoes of rebellion and regret, she realized that she was not just a reminder of the past, but a potential catalyst for change. She was a woman who had been given a second chance, a chance to rewrite the story, a chance to break the cycle of betrayal and revenge. But to do that, she would have to confront Nicolo, to challenge him, to force him to see the truth, to see her not as a ghost of the past, but as a woman of the present, a woman with her own desires, her own will, her own destiny. She closed the box, carefully retied the ribbon. The rain had stopped. A single shaft of sunlight pierced through the grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent promise of a new beginning, a new challenge. She had a feeling that confronting Nicolo with this newfound knowledge would be the most dangerous thing she had ever done. Chapter 6. A Glimmer of Unexpected Kindness. Valeria spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet contemplation. The letters had stirred something deep within her, a sense of purpose, a determination to confront the past and, hopefully, change the future. She knew she needed to speak to Nicolo, but she also knew that she needed to tread carefully. She couldn't simply barge into his study and demand answers. She needed a plan, a strategy. She decided to wait until after dinner, hoping that the formality of the meal would provide a buffer, a chance to gauge his mood, to find an opening. As she dressed for dinner, she chose a simple, but elegant, blue dress, a color that she felt projected both calmness and confidence. She added a small, silver necklace, a gift from her mother, a tangible reminder of her own family, her own history. Dinner, as usual, was a silent affair. Nicolo was even more withdrawn than usual, his gaze fixed on his plate, his expression unreadable. Valeria picked at her food, her mind racing, trying to find the right words, the right moment. As the servants cleared the plates, Valeria took a deep breath and spoke. "Don Nicolo," she said, her voice steady, "I would like to speak to you about something important." He looked up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what is that, Valeria?" he asked, his voice neutral. "I've been exploring the villa," she said, choosing her words carefully. "And I have discovered some things. Things that have disturbed me." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "Disturbed you? In what way?" "I have been reading about the history of your family," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And I have learned about the other Valeria, the woman who was promised your grandfather." His expression hardened, his eyes turning cold. "That is ancient history, Valeria," he said, his voice sharp. "It has nothing to do with you." "I believe it does," Valeria countered, her voice unwavering. "I believe I am here, in part, because of what happened between her and your grandfather. I believe I am a symbol of that past." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze intense. "You are a reminder," he corrected her. "A reminder of a betrayal, a reminder of a debt that must be repaid." "But what if that debt has already been paid?" Valeria asked, her voice rising slightly. "What if the story you have been told is not the whole truth? What if the other Valeria was not the villain she has been made out to be?" He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked towards the fireplace, his back to her, his silence adding to the tension in the room. "What are you suggesting, Valeria?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Valeria stood up as well, her legs trembling slightly, but her resolve unwavering. She walked towards him, stopping a few feet away. "I am suggesting that you have been living in the shadow of a lie," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am suggesting that the other Valeria was a victim, not a villain. And I am suggesting that you, Don Nicolo, are perpetuating a cycle of revenge that has gone on for far too long." He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with anger. "You know nothing of my family, Valeria," he said, his voice a low growl. You know nothing of the pain, the betrayal, the dishonor that woman brought upon us. I know what I have read, Valeria countered, her voice unwavering. And I have read letters written by the other Valeria, letters that tell a very different story. Letters that speak of love, of sacrifice, of a woman forced to make an impossible choice. His expression changed, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Letters? He asked, his voice softening slightly. What letters? Valeria took a deep breath. Letters she wrote to her lover, Alessandro, she said, her voice steady. Letters that reveal the truth about what happened, the truth about her feelings, the truth about her innocence. He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to decipher the truth. The anger seemed to fade, replaced by a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Where did you find these letters? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. In the old studio, Valeria replied. In a box, hidden away, like a secret that was meant to be kept buried. He walked past her, towards the door. Show me, he said, his voice commanding. Valeria followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. They walked in silence through the dimly lit corridors, the only sound the echo of their footsteps on the marble floors. They reached the old studio, and Valeria opened the door, revealing the dusty room, the unfinished paintings, the silent witnesses to a past that refused to stay buried. She led him to the table and showed him the box, the letters tied with the faded ribbon. He reached for the box, his fingers trembling slightly, and opened it. He took out the letters, his gaze fixed on the delicate script, the faded ink. He began to read, his expression changing with each passing word. The anger, the bitterness, seemed to melt away, replaced by a profound sadness, a deep regret. He read in silence, the only sound the rustling of the paper, the whisper of the past. Valeria watched him, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had carried for so long, the pain that had been based on a lie. Outside a dog barked, once, and then was silent. The clock in the hall struck the hour. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. I did not know, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I had been told a different story. A story of betrayal, of villainy. I had no idea. He sat down heavily in the dusty armchair, the letters falling from his hands. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Valeria knelt beside him, and, without thinking, she reached out and gently touched his arm. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily, the first time she had offered him comfort, not defiance. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed, his face streaked with tears. Thank you, Valeria, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you for showing me the truth. It was a glimmer of unexpected kindness, a crack in the armor of the formidable dawn, a moment of vulnerability that changed everything. It was the beginning of a new understanding, a new connection, a new possibility. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, replaced by a faint but growing light. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Dance of Deception. The revelation in the studio marked a turning point, but it was not a sudden, dramatic shift. Niccolò, while visibly affected by the letters, remained a man of deeply ingrained habits and suspicions. He was not one to easily shed the beliefs of a lifetime. The change was subtle, a gradual thawing of the ice that had surrounded him. He began to speak to Valeria more, to ask her opinion on matters, to share snippets of his own thoughts and feelings. However, the Moretti household was not a place of simple truths. While Niccolò grappled with the rewriting of his family history, other forces were at play. Isabella, the ever-present housekeeper, watched Valeria with a mixture of suspicion and something else, something that Valeria couldn't quite decipher. There were whispers among the staff, glances exchanged, secrets hinted at. Valeria felt like she was walking on eggshells, unsure of who to trust, unsure of what dangers lurked beneath the surface. One afternoon, while exploring the gardens, Valeria stumbled upon a small, secluded chapel. The door was unlocked, and she ventured inside, drawn by a sense of curiosity and a need for a quiet space to reflect. The chapel was simple, but beautiful, with stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the stone floor. There was a small altar and a single, flickering candle, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. As Valeria stood there, taking in the peaceful atmosphere, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see Isabella standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Signora Marchesi," Isabella said, her voice smooth and cultured, "I did not expect to find you here." Valeria managed a weak smile. "I was just exploring," she said, her voice slightly hesitant. "This is a beautiful chapel." Isabella nodded, her gaze lingering on Valeria for a moment. "It is a place of reflection," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "A place where secrets are often confessed." Valeria felt a sense of unease, a feeling that Isabella was hinting at something she couldn't quite grasp. "I don't have any secrets to confess," Valeria said, her voice slightly defensive. Isabella smiled, a faint, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps not yet, Signora Marchesi," she said, her voice a low murmur. "But in this house, secrets have a way of revealing themselves." She turned to leave, but then paused, her gaze returning to Valeria. "Be careful, Signora Marchesi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not everyone in this house is who they seem to be, and not everyone wishes you well." With that, Isabella left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Valeria alone in the chapel, her sense of unease growing stronger. Isabella's words were a warning, a veiled threat, a hint of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of the Moretti household. Valeria returned to her room, her mind racing. She tried to dismiss Isabella's words as the ramblings of a jealous, suspicious woman, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something darker, at play. She decided to confide in Niccolò, to tell him about her conversation with Isabella, to seek his guidance, his protection. She found him in his study, sitting at his desk, reviewing some papers. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening slightly. "Valeria," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is something wrong?" She hesitated, unsure how to begin. "I had a conversation with Isabella today," she said, her voice slightly hesitant. "And she said some things that disturbed me." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of concern in his gaze. "What did she say?" Valeria recounted her conversation with Isabella, her voice trembling slightly as she repeated Isabella's warning. Niccolò listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing word. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze intense. "Isabella is a complicated woman," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She has been with this family for many years, and she is fiercely loyal. But she is also possessive, and she does not easily trust outsiders." "But she seemed to be implying," Valeria said slowly, drawing the implication out. "She sees you as a threat." "Valeria," Niccolò interrupted, his voice firm. "A threat to the established order. A threat to me." He stood up and walked towards the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "There are those within this family," he said, his voice low and intense, "who do not approve of my softening towards you. They see you as a weakness, a vulnerability, a reminder of a past they would prefer to forget." He turned back to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "There is a power struggle within this family, Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur. "A struggle between those who cling to the old ways and those who seek a different path. And you, Valeria, have become a pawn in that struggle." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Be careful, Valeria," he said, his voice echoing Isabella's warning. "Trust no one. And watch your back. Because in this world, even the smallest misstep can have deadly consequences." The serpent's dance of deception had begun, and Valeria was caught in its coils, unsure of who to trust, unsure of who was friend or foe. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, and the game was far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. Chapter 8. Unveiling the Family Secrets. Niccolò's warning hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the precariousness of Valeria's position. She knew she had to be cautious, to watch every step, to trust no one completely. But she also knew that she couldn't simply hide in her room, waiting for the storm to pass. She had to understand the dynamics of the Moretti family, the forces that were at play, the secrets that lurked beneath the surface. She decided to start with the most obvious source of information, the family library. She spent hours there, poring over dusty volumes, searching for clues, for any hint of the power struggle Niccolò had mentioned. She found detailed family trees, tracing the lineage of the Morettis back for centuries, noting marriages, births, deaths, and the occasional cryptic annotation that hinted at conflict, betrayal, and intrigue. She discovered that Niccolò had a younger brother, Marco, who had died several years earlier in a car accident. The official accounts described it as a tragic accident, but there were whispers, rumors, hints of foul play. Marco, it seemed, had been a rival to Niccolò, a challenger to his authority, a man who had advocated for a more modern approach to the family business. Valeria also learned more about Isabella, the enigmatic housekeeper. She was not just a servant, but a distant relative of the Morettis, a woman who had been raised within the family, a woman who had been deeply devoted to Marco. Isabella had been like a mother to both brothers. Rumor was that when their mother died, she was inconsolable. She never married and never had children. As Valeria pieced together the fragments of information, a picture began to emerge. A picture of a family divided, a family torn apart by ambition, rivalry, and a deep-seated resentment towards Niccolò's leadership. Isabella, it seemed, was not just a loyal servant, but a key player in this power struggle, a woman who had her own agenda, her own secrets. One evening, Valeria decided to take a walk in the gardens, hoping to clear her head and perhaps find some solace in the beauty of nature. As she wandered along a secluded pathway, she heard voices coming from a small, stone gazebo. She recognized one of the voices as Niccolò's and the other as Isabella's. She cautiously approached the gazebo, hiding behind a thick hedge, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't see them, but she could hear their conversation clearly. "You are becoming too attached to her, Niccolò," Isabella was saying, her voice sharp and accusatory. "She is a distraction, a weakness, a threat to everything we have worked for." "She is not a threat, Isabella," Niccolò replied, his voice firm but weary. "She is different. She has opened my eyes to things I had refused to see." "She is manipulating you, Niccolò," Isabella insisted, her voice rising in anger. "She is using you, just like her namesake did to your grandfather. She is a serpent, coiled and ready to strike." "That is enough, Isabella," Niccolò said, his voice dangerously low. "I will not tolerate such disrespect. Valeria is under my protection, and I will not allow anyone to harm her." "You are blinded by her, Niccolò," Isabella spat back. "You are forgetting your duty, your responsibility to this family, to the memory of your brother." There was a long silence, the tension thick and heavy. Valeria held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to be discovered. "Marco is gone, Isabella," Niccolò said finally, his voice filled with a profound sadness. "And I will not allow his death to be used as a weapon against me, or against anyone else." "You are a fool, Niccolò," Isabella said, her voice cold and bitter. "And you will regret this. You will regret trusting her." Valeria heard the sound of footsteps, and she quickly retreated, hurrying back to the villa, her mind racing. The conversation she had overheard confirmed her suspicions. Isabella was indeed a threat, a woman driven by a deep-seated resentment and a desire for revenge. She was not just protecting the family's interests, but pursuing her own agenda, an agenda that clearly involved eliminating Valeria. Valeria knew she had to tell Niccolò what she had heard, but she also knew that she had to be careful. She couldn't simply accuse Isabella of treachery without proof. She needed evidence, something concrete that would convince Niccolò of the danger she was in. She returned to the library, determined to find something, anything, that would expose Isabella's true motives. She searched through the books, the documents, the letters, looking for a connection, a link between Isabella and Marco's death. And then she found it. A small, faded photograph, tucked away in a dusty album. The photograph showed Marco, young and handsome, standing next to Isabella, her arm around him, a possessive, almost maternal, gesture. On the back of the photograph, in Isabella's handwriting, were the words, "My beloved Marco, my son in all but blood, my future, my hope." The words were a revelation, a confirmation of Valeria's suspicions. Isabella had seen Marco as her protégé, her heir, the man who would carry on her legacy, her vision for the family. And Niccolò, by taking Marco's place, by embracing a different path, had become her enemy. And Valeria, by gaining Niccolò's trust, had become a target. The family's secrets were finally unveiled, and the truth was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She knew now that she was not just fighting for her own survival, but for Niccolò's as well. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows of the library, a fitting soundtrack to the storm that was about to break. Chapter 9. Scars of Loyalty and Betrayal. Valeria knew she had to act quickly. Isabella's animosity was no longer a veiled threat, it was an open declaration of war. She decided to confront Niccolò immediately, to show him the photograph, to expose Isabella's true motives. She found him in his study, as usual, poring over documents. He looked up as she entered, a faint smile gracing his lips. "Valeria," he said, his voice warm. "What brings you here?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Niccolò, I need to show you something," she said, her voice urgent. "Something I found in the library." She walked towards his desk and placed the photograph in front of him. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the image, his expression slowly changing from curiosity to disbelief to anger. He looked up at her, his eyes dark and troubled. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "In an old album," Valeria replied, her voice steady. "Hidden away, like a secret that was meant to be kept buried." He read the inscription on the back of the photograph, his jaw clenching, his knuckles turning white. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked towards the window, his back to her, his silence amplifying the tension in the room. I knew Isabella was devoted to Marco," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But I never realized the extent of her obsession." "She sees you as an obstacle, Niccolò," Valeria said, her voice softening. "She sees you as the reason Marco is gone. And she sees me as a threat to her plans." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "She would not dare," he began, but his voice trailed off, the doubt evident in his tone. "She already has," Valeria countered, her voice firm. "She warned me. She threatened me. She made it clear that she does not want me here. And I overheard her talking to you, Niccolò. She accused me of manipulating you, of being a serpent, of being just like the other Valeria." He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to decipher the truth. He walked towards her, stopping just a few feet away. "Did you also hear me defend you?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Did you hear me tell her that I would not tolerate her disrespect, that you were under my protection?" Valeria met his gaze, without flinching. "Yes, I heard you, Niccolò," she said, her voice steady. "But I also know that Isabella is not a woman to be underestimated. She is cunning, she is resourceful, and she is ruthless." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was surprisingly tender, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his eyes. "I will not let her harm you, Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I promise you that." Valeria felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to trust. She had seen a glimpse of the man behind the mask, the man behind the title of Don, a man capable of both tenderness and fierce protectiveness. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He removed his hand, his expression hardening. "I will confront her," he said, his voice firm. "I will demand answers. And I will deal with her accordingly." He turned and walked towards the door. "Stay here," he said, his voice commanding. "Do not leave this room until I return." Valeria nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched him leave, her mind filled with a mixture of apprehension and hope. She had placed her trust in him, and now she could only wait and pray that he would be able to handle Isabella, to protect them both from her wrath. She paced the room, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. She looked out the window, the sky darkening, the storm clouds gathering, mirroring the turmoil within her and, she suspected, within the villa itself. The wait seemed endless. Time stretched, distorted, each second an eternity. She heard noises from other parts of the house, raised voices, the sound of something breaking, a muffled cry. Her imagination ran wild, conjuring up images of violence, of betrayal, of tragedy. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Niccolò returned. His face was pale, his expression grim, his clothes slightly disheveled. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What happened?" Valeria asked, her voice urgent, her heart pounding in her chest. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a deep regret. She confessed, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. She admitted everything. Her obsession with Marco, her resentment towards me, her involvement in his death. Valeria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She killed him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Niccolò nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "It was an accident, she claims," he said, his voice strained. "A struggle, a moment of madness. But she did it. She took him from me. She took him from all of us." He pushed himself away from the door and walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze locking with hers. "I've sent her away," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She is gone. She will never return." Valeria reached out and gently touched his arm, offering him comfort, support. "I am so sorry, Niccolò," she said, her voice filled with empathy. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "The scars of loyalty and betrayal run deep in this family, Valeria," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But perhaps we can begin to heal. Perhaps we can find a new path, a new beginning." The storm outside had begun to subside, the clouds parting, revealing a sliver of moonlight, a fragile symbol of hope amidst the darkness. The air in the room felt different, lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The scars remained, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could finally begin to fade. Chapter 10. A forbidden connection ignites. With Isabella gone, a palpable shift occurred within the Moretti estate. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the villa began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of calm. Niccolò, freed from the constant shadow of Isabella's influence, seemed to relax, to become more approachable, more human. He started spending more time with Valeria, not just at the formal dinners, but in casual conversations, in shared moments in the gardens, in the library, even in her studio, watching her paint, asking questions about her art, about her life before she came to Sicily. He began to open up to her, sharing stories of his childhood, his relationship with Marco, his struggles with the weight of his responsibilities as the head of the Moretti family. He revealed his regrets, his doubts, his fears, his vulnerabilities. He was no longer just the formidable Don, but a man, a complex, flawed, and deeply wounded man. Valeria, in turn, found herself drawn to him, not just out of a sense of obligation or gratitude, but out of a genuine connection, a growing affection. She saw beyond his power, his wealth, his reputation, and saw the man beneath, the man who had been trapped by his past, the man who is now, slowly, tentatively, reaching out for something more. One evening, after a particularly pleasant dinner, filled with laughter and easy conversation, Niccolò invited Valeria to join him for a walk on the cliffs. The night was clear, the moon full, casting a silvery glow on the sea. The air was warm and balmy, scented with the fragrance of jasmine and salt. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle crashing of the waves against the rocks below. The beauty of the scene was breathtaking, but it was the unspoken connection between them that filled the air, a palpable energy, a silent understanding. They stopped at a point overlooking the sea, the view stretching out before them, endless and majestic. Nico Lowe turned to Valeria, his eyes searching hers, his expression filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "Valeria," he said, his voice low and resonant, I know this is not how our relationship began. I know I brought you here against your will, that I forced you into this life." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground, his silence filled with a deep regret. "But things have changed," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have changed, and I believe you have changed too." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. I have come to care for you, Valeria," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Deeply. More than I ever thought possible." Valeria's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She had known, deep down, that this moment was coming, but she was still unprepared for the intensity of his words, the vulnerability in his eyes. "Nico Lowe," she said, her voice trembling slightly, I care for you too. More than I ever thought possible." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. His touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. He leaned in, his gaze locking with hers, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. "I know this is forbidden," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know the complexities, the dangers. But I cannot deny what I feel. I cannot deny you." He lowered his head and kissed her, gently at first, tentatively, then with a growing passion, a desperate need. Valeria responded in kind, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss was a culmination of everything that had transpired between them, the fear, the anger, the resentment, the secrets, the revelations, the growing understanding, the tentative trust, the undeniable attraction. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that acknowledged the forbidden connection that had ignited between them, a kiss that promised a future filled with both passion and peril. The world around them faded away, the sound of the waves, the scent of the sea, the moonlight, all disappearing into the intensity of the moment. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked in a gaze of mutual desire and apprehension. The reality of their situation, the complexities of their world, the dangers that lurked around every corner, came crashing back down upon them. What happens now?" Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. Nico Lowe looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "We face it," he said, his voice firm. "Together. We face whatever comes. We fight for our happiness. We fight for us." He kissed her again, a kiss that sealed their promise, a kiss that defied the odds, a kiss that ignited a forbidden love, a love born in the shadows, a love that would either save them or destroy them. The moon, a silent witness to their clandestine embrace, cast a long, silvery shadow across the cliffs, a symbol of the uncertain, but undeniably passionate, path that lay ahead. Chapter 11. The Price of Defiance and Desire. The days that followed their first kiss were filled with a clandestine joy, a stolen happiness. Valeria and Nico Lowe found moments to be together, sneaking away from the watchful eyes of the household staff, meeting in the gardens, in the library, in her studio, their conversations whispered, their touches fleeting, their passion a constant undercurrent, a forbidden flame burning brightly in the darkness. They knew their relationship was a dangerous game, a defiance of tradition, a challenge to the unspoken rules of their world. The Moretti family, even without Isabella's direct influence, was still a force to be reckoned with. There were others, relatives, associates, allies, who would not approve of their union, who would see it as a weakness, a betrayal of the family's honor, a threat to their power. Nico Lowe, despite his growing love for Valeria, was still the head of the family, still bound by his responsibilities, his obligations, his duty. He had to maintain a facade of strength, of control, of unwavering adherence to the code. He couldn't simply flaunt his relationship with Valeria, couldn't simply declare his love for her to the world. One afternoon, while Valeria was painting in her studio, Nico Lowe came to see her, his expression troubled, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a weariness that tugged at her heart. "Valeria," he said, his voice low and strained, "we need to talk." She put down her brush, her heart sinking, a sense of dread washing over her. "What is it, Nicolo?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He walked towards her, stopping just a few feet away, his gaze avoiding hers. "I have received a summons," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "From the council." Valeria knew what that meant. The council was the governing body of the Sicilian Mafia, a group of powerful families who met regularly to discuss matters of mutual interest, to settle disputes, to enforce the code. What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. "They want to discuss you," he said, his voice barely audible. "Your presence in my household, your influence on me. They are concerned." Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it was still terrifying. She was a threat, an outsider, a disruption to their carefully ordered world. What will you do?" she asked, her voice filled with a desperate plea. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "I will defend you, Valeria," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I will tell them the truth. I will tell them that I love you." Valeria's heart soared at his words, but her fear remained. She knew the power of the council, the ruthlessness of their methods, the unforgiving nature of their code. "But what if they don't accept it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if they demand that you give me up?" He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. "I will never give you up, Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her ear. "Never. I would rather die than lose you." His words were a promise, a vow, a declaration of love that defied the dangers that surrounded them. But they were also a warning, a reminder of the price of their defiance, the price of their desire. "There's something else," Nicolo said, his voice hesitant. He stepped back slightly and pulled a folded, cream-colored envelope from his inside jacket pocket. He handled it as though it was something dangerous, something to be feared. "What is it?" Valeria asked, although she already had a sinking, sick feeling in her stomach. "It's an invitation," Nicolo said slowly, "to a gathering, hosted by the Rossi family." Valeria knew the Rossi family. They were one of the most powerful families in the council, and rivals of the Morettis. There was a long, bitter history between the two clans, a feud that spanned generations. "Why would they invite us?" Valeria asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "It's a gesture of reconciliation, they claim," Nicolo replied, his voice laced with skepticism. "A chance to bury the hatchet, to forge a new alliance." He handed her the invitation. It was written in elegant script, on thick, expensive paper, bearing the Rossi family crest, a snarling wolf, a symbol of their ferocity and cunning. Valeria looked at Nicolo, her eyes searching his. "Do you trust them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, his expression grim. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I do not trust them, but I cannot refuse. It would be seen as a sign of weakness, an insult, a provocation. I have to go, and I have to take you with me." The price of their defiance and desire had just been revealed. They were walking into a trap, a carefully orchestrated dance of deception and danger, and they knew it. But they also knew that they had no choice. They were bound by their love, by their defiance, by the unspoken rules of their world. They would face the storm together, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined, their fate uncertain. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long, ominous shadows across the room, a fitting prelude to the darkness that awaited them. Chapter 12. Shattered Illusions and New Beginnings. The Rossi estate was a stark contrast to the Moretti villa. While the Moretti home possessed an ancient, brooding grandeur, the Rossi estate was a display of modern opulence, all gleaming marble, sparkling chandeliers, and ostentatious displays of wealth. It was a palace built on new money, a testament to the Rossi family's ruthless ambition and their willingness to embrace the less traditional methods of acquiring wealth. Valeria, dressed in a stunning emerald green gown that Niccolò had insisted she wear, felt a sense of unease as they entered the lavishly decorated ballroom. The room was filled with people, the elite of the Sicilian Mafia, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and veiled hostility. The air was thick with tension, the whispers following them like shadows, the smiles not quite reaching the eyes. Niccolò, his arm protectively around Valeria's waist, guided her through the crowd, his expression carefully neutral, his demeanor radiating an aura of controlled power. He introduced her to various members of the council, their names a litany of infamous families, their greetings polite but guarded, their eyes assessing her, weighing her, judging her. Valeria played her part, smiling, nodding, making polite conversation, but her heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. She felt like a lamb surrounded by wolves, a pawn in a deadly game she didn't fully understand. The head of the Rossi family, Don Angelo Rossi, a man in his late 60s with a silver mane of hair and a piercing gaze, greeted them with a calculated warmth, his smile a mask of insincerity. "Don Niccolò," he said, his voice smooth and oily, "so glad you could make it. And this must be the lovely Signora Marchesi. We have heard so much about you." His eyes lingered on Valeria, his gaze assessing, predatory, making her skin crawl. She forced a smile, her hand tightening around Niccolò's. "Don Angelo," Niccolò replied, his voice equally smooth, equally guarded. "Thank you for your hospitality." The evening progressed, a carefully choreographed dance of deception, a series of veiled threats and subtle power plays. Valeria noticed the glances exchanged between Niccolò and other members of the council, the unspoken messages, the alliances and rivalries that simmered beneath the surface of polite conversation. During a brief moment alone with Niccolò, Valeria whispered, "I don't like this, Niccolò. I feel like we're walking into a trap." He nodded, his expression grim. "We are," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But we have to play the game. We have to show them that we are not afraid, that we are united." As the evening wore on, Valeria began to notice a pattern in the conversations, a recurring theme. Several members of the council, seemingly independently, brought up the subject of Niccolò's succession. They questioned his focus, his commitment, his suitability to lead, hinting at the need for a younger, more vigorous leader. Valeria realized, with a growing sense of horror, that this was not just about her. It was about Niccolò. It was a coup, a carefully orchestrated plan to remove him from power, to replace him with someone more amenable to their interests. And she, Valeria, was merely a pawn in their game, a convenient excuse to challenge his authority. The realization struck her like a physical blow. The illusions she had held, the tentative hope for a future with Niccolò, shattered into a million pieces. She was not just fighting for her own survival, but for his. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the odds were stacked against them. As the evening reached its climax, Don Angelo Rossi raised his glass for a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice booming across the room, his eyes locking with Niccolò's. "To alliances, and to the future of our families." The toast was a challenge, a declaration of intent, a thinly veiled threat. Niccolò met his gaze without flinching, his expression hardening, his hand tightening around Valeria's. He raised his own glass, his voice clear and strong. "To the future," he echoed, his voice filled with a defiant resolve. "And to loyalty, true loyalty." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a promise, a declaration of war. The room fell silent, the tension palpable, the smiles fading, the masks dropping. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. As they left the Rossi estate, the illusion of civility shattered completely. Niccolò's car was surrounded by armed men, their faces grim, their weapons visible. "Niccolò," Valeria cried, her voice filled with terror. "Stay calm, Valeria," he said, his voice firm, his hand reaching for a hidden compartment beneath the dashboard. "We knew this was coming. He pulled out a gun, his movements swift and practiced. He was no longer the charming, vulnerable man she had fallen in love with, but the formidable Don, the ruthless leader of the Moretti family, a man prepared to fight for his survival, for his power, for her. The night erupted in a hail of gunfire, a violent clash of power, a brutal reminder of the world they inhabited, a world where love and loyalty were often overshadowed by betrayal and death. Valeria, caught in the crossfire, felt a searing pain in her arm, and then darkness. The shattered illusions of a peaceful future were replaced by the harsh reality of their present, a present filled with violence, uncertainty, and the desperate fight for a new beginning, a beginning that might never come. Chapter 13. The Gathering Storm of Vendettas. Valeria awoke to the smell of antiseptic and the dull ache of her arm. She was in a private room, dimly lit, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her back against the pillows. Her arm was bandaged, and an IV drip was attached to her hand. She remembered the chaos at the Rossi estate, the gunfire, the searing pain, and then nothing. She looked around the room, her heart pounding in her chest, searching for a familiar face, a sign of Niccolò. The door opened, and a doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and tired eyes. "Signora Marchesi," she said, her voice gentle. "You are awake. How are you feeling? Where is Niccolò?" Valeria asked, her voice hoarse and weak, her fear overriding her pain. The doctor's expression softened. "He is safe, Signora Marchesi," she said, her voice reassuring. "He brought you here himself. He has been waiting for you to wake up." Relief washed over Valeria, a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. He was alive. He was safe. That was all that mattered. My arm?" Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You were shot," the doctor replied, her voice matter of fact. "But the bullet passed through cleanly. There is no serious damage. You will need to rest and to take care of the wound, but you'll make a full recovery." The doctor checked her vitals, adjusted the IV drip, and then smiled reassuringly. "I will let Don Niccolò know you are awake," she said, her voice lowering slightly, a hint of respect, perhaps even fear in her tone. The doctor left, and a few moments later, Niccolò entered the room. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn, his clothes stained with blood, but his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a relief that mirrored her own. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside the bed, taking her hand in his touch gentle, reverent. "Valeria," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "thank God you are all right. I thought I had lost you." Tears streamed down Valeria's face, tears of relief, of gratitude, of love. "Niccolò," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "I was so scared." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently, his touch sending shivers down her spine. "I know," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know, but you're safe now. I promise you, I will not let anyone harm you." He sat beside her on the bed, holding her hand, his presence a source of comfort, of strength, of hope. He told her what had happened after she had lost consciousness. He had managed to fight off the Rossi assassins, with the help of his own men, who had been waiting nearby, anticipating trouble. He had driven her to this private clinic, a place known for its discretion, its loyalty to the Moretti family. The Rossi attack was a declaration of war, Niccolò said, his voice grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "They have broken the code. They have crossed the line. There will be consequences." Valeria knew what that meant. Retribution. Revenge. A bloody vendetta that would engulf the Sicilian underworld, a storm of violence that would consume everything in its path. "But what about us, Niccolò?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart filled with a growing dread. "What happens now?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "We fight, Valeria," he said, his voice firm. "We fight for our survival. We fight for our future. We fight for our love." He leaned in and kissed her, gently at first, then with a growing passion, a desperate need. The kiss was a promise, a vow, a declaration of defiance against the forces that sought to tear them apart. But even as they clung to each other, seeking solace in their love, they knew that the storm was gathering, the vendetta was brewing, and their future was more uncertain than ever. The price of their defiance had been paid in blood, and the price of their survival would be even higher. The gathering storm of vendettas was about to break, and they were caught in its center, their love a fragile flame in the face of overwhelming darkness. They were now, truly, alone against the world, a world determined to keep them apart. The sterile scent of the clinic was a harsh reminder of the precariousness of their situation, a constant whisper of the dangers that lay ahead. Chapter 14. Whispers in the Dark of Night. Valeria's recovery was slow but steady. Nicolo was a constant presence at her bedside, his concern and affection unwavering. He rarely left her side, sleeping in a chair in her room, holding her hand, whispering words of comfort and reassurance. He was both her protector and her caretaker, his strength a source of solace in her vulnerability. During the long hours of the night, when the clinic was quiet and the world outside seemed to fade away, they talked. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They spoke of a future they both desperately wanted, a future free from violence, from secrets, from the suffocating constraints of their world. Nicolo confessed his growing disillusionment with the Mafia, with the endless cycle of violence and betrayal. He spoke of his desire to break free, to find a different path, a different life, a life where he could be with Valeria without fear, without compromise, without constantly looking over his shoulder. Valeria, in turn, shared her own dreams, her longing for a simple life, a life filled with art, with beauty, with peace. She spoke of her desire to paint again, to create, to express herself without the constant weight of fear and uncertainty. Their whispered conversations in the dark of night were a sanctuary, a refuge from the storm that raged outside. They were a testament to their love, a testament to their resilience, a testament to their shared hope for a future that seemed increasingly improbable, increasingly fragile. One night, as Valeria lay in bed, her hand clasped in Nicolo's, she asked him the question that had been haunting her since the attack at the Rossi estate. "Nicolo," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "why did they do it? Why did the Rossi family attack us?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to their intertwined hands, his silence filled with a deep reluctance. "There are many reasons, Valeria," he said finally, his voice strained. "Old rivalries, power struggles, business disputes, but there is something more, something personal." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and shame. "The Rossi family," he said, his voice barely audible, "have always coveted something that belonged to the Morettas. Something precious. Something irreplaceable." Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. She had a feeling she knew what he was talking about. "The other Valeria?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Nicolo nodded, his gaze confirming her suspicion. "The Rossi family," he said, his voice low and intense, "believe that you are the key to reclaiming what they believe is rightfully theirs. They believe that you possess something that belonged to the other Valeria, something that holds the secret to a great treasure." Valeria's mind reeled. A treasure? What treasure? She had no knowledge of any treasure, any secret inheritance. She was just a woman, a painter, a widow who had been dragged into this world against her will. I don't understand, Nicolo," she said, her voice filled with confusion. "I have nothing. I know nothing of any treasure." He squeezed her hand, his touch reassuring. "I know, Valeria," he said, his voice gentle. "I believe you. But they do not. They believe that you are the key, that you hold the secret, whether you know it or not." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "There is a legend," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "a story passed down through generations. A story of a hidden treasure, a treasure that belonged to the original Valeria, a treasure that was stolen from her by my grandfather." He looked away, his expression filled with a deep shame. "The Rossi family," he said, his voice strained, believe that this treasure is rightfully theirs. And they believe that you, Valeria, are the key to finding it. The whispers in the dark of night had revealed a new layer of complexity, a new level of danger. Valeria was not just a pawn in a power struggle, but a target in a centuries-old quest for a mythical treasure. She was caught in a web of lies, of deceit, of ancient vendettas, and she had no idea how to escape. The legend, the treasure, the Rossi family's obsession, it all seemed like a cruel, twisted game, a game she never wanted to play. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had no choice. She was in it, whether she liked it or not, and her survival and Nicolo's depended on unraveling the truth, on finding the treasure, on breaking the cycle of violence and revenge that had haunted their families for generations. The soft beeping of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of her vulnerability, a counterpoint to the dangerous secrets that were slowly being revealed. Chapter 15. A Test of Unwavering Trust. After a week in the clinic, Valeria was deemed well enough to return to the Moretti villa. The return, however, was not a homecoming to a place of safety and comfort. The villa, while still physically imposing, felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension and apprehension. The staff, while outwardly polite, were noticeably more reserved, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Nicolo, despite his outward calm, was a man on edge. He had increased security around the villa, posting armed guards at every entrance, patrolling the grounds day and night. He was constantly on alert, his senses heightened, his hand never far from the gun he now carried at all times. He knew that the Rossi family would not let the failed assassination attempt go unpunished. They would strike again, harder, more ruthlessly, and he had to be prepared. He had to protect Valeria, protect his family, protect his legacy. But the threat did not only come from outside. Nicolo knew that there were those within his own family, within his own inner circle, who doubted him, who questioned his judgment, who saw his relationship with Valeria as a weakness, a liability. He could feel their eyes on him, their whispers following him, their loyalty uncertain. One evening, as Valeria and Nicolo sat in his study, discussing the precariousness of their situation, there was a knock on the door. Nicolo's second-in-command, a man named Salvatore, entered, his expression grim, his demeanor urgent. "Don Nicolo," he said, his voice low and respectful, "we have a problem." Nicolo's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "What is it, Salvatore?" he asked, his voice firm, controlled. Salvatore hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Valeria, his reluctance evident. Nicolo understood his hesitation. Salvatore was loyal, but he was also a traditionalist, a man who believed in the old ways, a man who likely saw Valeria as an outsider, a threat. "Speak freely, Salvatore," Nicolo said, his voice commanding. "Signora Marchesi is privy to all matters concerning this family." Salvatore nodded, his expression still guarded. "We have received information," he said, his voice low and urgent, "that the Rossi family is planning another attack. A bigger attack. They are mobilizing their forces. They are coming for us." Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. The gathering storm was about to break, the vendetta was about to explode, and they were in the eye of the storm. "When?" Nicolo asked, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying a flicker of anxiety. "We do not know the exact timing," Salvatore replied, his voice strained. "But soon. Very soon. They are eager to avenge their humiliation." Nicolo stood up, his movements decisive, his demeanor radiating an aura of controlled power. "We will be ready for them," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "We will defend ourselves. We will crush them." He turned to Valeria, his expression softening slightly. "Valeria," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to stay safe. I need you to trust me." Valeria met his gaze without flinching, her heart pounding in her chest, but her resolve unwavering. "I do trust you, Nicolo," she said, her voice clear and strong. "With all my heart." Her words were a testament to her love, a testament to her courage, a testament to her faith in him. But they were also a test of unwavering trust in the face of overwhelming danger. Nicolo nodded, his eyes searching hers, seeing the truth, the sincerity, the love in her gaze. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "I will not let them harm you, Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her ear.
"I promise you that."
"I will protect you, even if it costs me everything." He gave instructions to Salvatore for the defense of their home and the protection of Valeria should the worst happen. It was clear that there was now an expectation of an attack. The servants had packed small bags, ready to leave at a moment's notice, should they be ordered to. He turned back to Valeria. "I love you, Valeria," he said, his voice filled with a raw emotion, a desperate need. "I love you more than life itself." He kissed her, a passionate, desperate kiss, a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that defied the dangers that surrounded them, a kiss that promised a future that might never come. The test of unwavering trust had been passed, but the trial was far from over. The whispers in the dark of night had turned into shouts, and the shouts were about to become screams. The storm was upon them, and their love, their courage, their trust would be tested to the limit. The villa, once a symbol of power and security, now felt like a cage, a trap, a place where their fate would be decided, a place where their love would either triumph or be consumed by the flames of vengeance. Chapter 16. The Heart's Reckoning with Fate. The attack came, as expected, in the dead of night. A coordinated assault, swift and brutal, designed to overwhelm the Moretti defenses and leave Nicolo and Valeria vulnerable. Explosions rocked the villa, shattering windows, collapsing walls, sending plumes of smoke and fire into the night sky. Gunfire erupted, a cacophony of violence, a deadly symphony of destruction. Valeria, awakened by the first explosion, found herself thrown from her bed, her body slamming against the floor. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, her senses on high alert. She knew, instinctively, that this was it, the moment of truth, the ultimate test of their survival. Nicolo burst into her room, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and fear. He was armed, a gun in each hand, his movements swift and practiced, his demeanor radiating an aura of deadly calm. "Valeria!" he shouted, his voice barely audible above the din of the explosions and gunfire. "We have to go.
Now."
He grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the door, his grip tight, protective. They moved through the corridors of the villa, now a chaotic maze of smoke, fire, and debris. The sounds of fighting were everywhere, the screams of men, the shattering of glass, the roar of flames. They reached a hidden passage, a secret escape route known only to a select few. Nicolo pushed her inside, following close behind, his body shielding hers from the danger. The passage was dark and narrow, the air thick with dust and the smell of fear. As they moved through the passage, Valeria stumbled, her injured arm throbbing with pain. Nicolo caught her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern, his breath warm against her ear. "I think so," Valeria replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Just my arm." He examined her arm, his touch gentle, his eyes filled with a tenderness that belied the chaos surrounding them. "It is bleeding again," he said, his voice strained. "We need to stop, to bandage it." They found a small alcove, a hidden recess in the wall. Nicolo tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and carefully bandaged her arm, his movements precise and efficient, his touch surprisingly soothing. As he worked, their eyes met, their gaze locking in a silent understanding, a shared moment of intimacy amidst the violence and chaos. They knew that they might not survive this night, that this might be their last moment together. "I love you, Valeria," Nicolo said, his voice raw with emotion, his eyes filled with a desperate longing. "I love you, Nicolo," Valeria replied, her voice choked with tears, her heart overflowing with a love that defied the dangers that surrounded them. He kissed her, a passionate, desperate kiss, a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that spoke of a love that would endure, even in the face of death. They clung to each other, seeking solace in their embrace, drawing strength from their shared love, their shared hope, their shared destiny. They continued their escape, moving through the darkness, their hearts pounding in unison, their steps guided by instinct and a desperate will to survive. They emerged from the passage into the gardens, the night sky ablaze with the flames of the burning villa, the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. They were not alone. Armed men, Rossi assassins, were waiting for them, their faces grim, their weapons trained on them. It was a trap, a carefully orchestrated ambush, designed to eliminate them once and for all. Niccolò pushed Valeria behind him, his body shielding hers, his guns raised, ready to fight, ready to die for her. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but his determination was unwavering, his love for Valeria his driving force, his ultimate weapon. "Run, Valeria," he shouted, his voice commanding, his eyes filled with a desperate plea.
Run.
"Save yourself." Valeria hesitated, her heart torn between her love for Niccolò and her instinct for survival. She knew that he was sacrificing himself for her, that he was giving her a chance to escape, a chance to live.
No, Niccolò,
she cried, her voice filled with anguish. "I will not leave you. I will not abandon you." She stepped forward, standing beside him, her hand reaching for his, her fingers intertwining with his. They stood together, facing their enemies, their love a shield against the darkness, their courage a beacon in the face of despair. Their joined hands were a symbol of their bond, a testament of defiance and bravery. The heart's reckoning with fate had come, and they were ready to face it, together, united in their love, their courage, their unwavering commitment to each other. The outcome was uncertain, the future unknown, but their love would endure, a timeless testament to the power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in the darkest of nights. The sound of gunfire erupted once more, shattering the stillness, engulfing them in a final, deadly embrace. Chapter 17. Blood and Roses on the Horizon. The gunfire was deafening, a relentless barrage of bullets that seemed to come from all directions. Valeria closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, for the searing pain, for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, she heard a different sound, a new sound, a sound that filled her with a surge of hope. The sound of reinforcements, of Niccolò's men, arriving on the scene, their guns blazing, their voices raised in a defiant roar. The tide of the battle turned. The Rossi assassins, caught off guard, their carefully planned ambush disrupted, found themselves overwhelmed, outgunned, outnumbered. The fighting was fierce, brutal, a chaotic dance of death, but Niccolò's men, fueled by loyalty and a fierce determination to protect their dawn, fought with a ferocity that matched their enemies. Valeria, her hand still clasped in Niccolò's, watched in a daze, her mind struggling to comprehend the sudden shift in their fortunes. She saw Niccolò, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a cold fury, fighting with a skill and a ruthlessness that both terrified and awed her. He was a warrior, a protector, a man fighting for his life, for his love, for his future. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity. The gardens transformed into a bloody battlefield, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and death. But slowly, gradually, the Rossi forces began to falter, their numbers dwindling, their attack losing momentum. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the gunfire ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded, the crackling of the flames, the sobs of the dying. Valeria opened her eyes, her gaze searching for Niccolò, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw him, standing amidst the carnage, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face streaked with soot and sweat, but his eyes were filled with a triumphant relief, a fierce determination, a love that burned brighter than ever. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, his gaze locking with hers. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion, his breath warm against her skin. Valeria nodded, her voice choked with tears, her body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline, the fear, the relief. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I am all right." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, his body a shield against the horrors of the night. They clung to each other, seeking solace in their embrace, drawing strength from their shared love, their shared survival. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The Rossi family had been dealt a severe blow, but they were not defeated. They would regroup, they would retaliate, they would continue their quest for vengeance. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, casting a surreal glow on the blood-soaked gardens, Niccolò and Valeria stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts intertwined, their love a beacon of hope amidst the devastation. They had survived the night, but they knew that the future remained uncertain, the dangers still lurking, the challenges still immense. They had paid a heavy price for their defiance, their love, their survival. Niccolò surveyed the scene. His home, or what had been his home, was ruined. But amongst the wreckage, something caught his eye. It was a rose bush. Inexplicably, it had survived, amid the fighting and chaos. And on it bloomed one perfect red rose. He reached out and gently, carefully broke it off. He turned back to Valeria, the single red rose held between his fingers. He offered it to her. "Blood and roses, Valeria," he said, his voice low and intense, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "That is our life. That is our love. A mixture of violence and beauty, of pain and hope." Valeria took the rose, her fingers brushing against his, her heart overflowing with a love that defied the odds, a love that had survived the storm, a love that would endure. The blood and roses on the horizon were a symbol of their future, a future filled with both challenges and possibilities, a future they would face together, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The scent of the rose, sweet and delicate, mingled with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder, a poignant reminder of the duality of their existence, a symbol of the beauty that could still bloom amidst the ruins. Chapter 18. Echoes of the past resurface. The destruction of the villa forced a change of plans, a relocation to a more secure, more discreet location. Niccolò chose a remote farmhouse, nestled high in the Sicilian mountains, a place far from the prying eyes of the council, far from the reach of the Rossi family. The farmhouse was simple, rustic, but it possessed a quiet charm, a sense of peace that contrasted sharply with the opulence and violence of the Moretti villa. It was a place where Valeria and Niccolò could heal, could regroup, could plan their next move. But even in this secluded sanctuary, the echoes of the past continued to haunt them. The legend of the treasure, the Rossi family's obsession, the centuries-old vendetta, it all weighed heavily on their minds, a constant reminder of the dangers that still lurked, the challenges that still lay ahead. One afternoon, while exploring the farmhouse, Valeria discovered an old, dusty attic. It was filled with forgotten relics of the past, furniture covered in sheets, boxes overflowing with old documents, paintings stacked against the walls. It was a treasure trove of history, a repository of secrets, a place where the past seemed to come alive. As Valeria sifted through the dusty artifacts, she stumbled upon a small, wooden chest, similar to the ones she had found in the Moretti villa. Her heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. She knew, instinctively, that this chest held something important, something significant. She opened the chest, her hands trembling slightly. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, diaries, and a map. The letters were written in Italian, in a familiar, delicate script. It was the handwriting of the original Valeria, the woman who had been promised to Niccolò's grandfather, the woman who had sparked the centuries-old feud. The diaries chronicled Valeria's life, her thoughts, her feelings, her struggles. They told a story of forbidden love, of a woman torn between her duty to her family and her desire for happiness, of a woman who had dared to defy the rigid rules of her society. But it was the map that caught Valeria's attention. It was old, faded, drawn on parchment, its edges frayed and torn. It depicted a section of the Sicilian coastline, with various landmarks marked and a large X marking a specific location. It was, without a doubt, a treasure map, the map that led to the legendary treasure of the original Valeria. Valeria felt a surge of excitement, a sense of discovery. She had found it, the key to the mystery, the answer to the centuries-old question. But she also felt a sense of dread, a sense of foreboding. She knew that this map, this treasure, was the source of so much conflict, so much violence, so much pain. She took the chest to Niccolò, showing him her discovery, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He examined the map, his eyes widening in disbelief, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. This changes everything, Valeria," he said, his voice low and intense. "This is what the Rossi family has been searching for generations. This is the source of their obsession." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "But what do we do with it?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Do we try to find the treasure? Do we use it as leverage? Do we destroy it?" Valeria hesitated, her mind racing, her heart torn. She knew that the treasure, whatever it was, held the key to ending the vendetta, to breaking the cycle of violence, to securing their future. But she also knew that it was a dangerous game, a game that could cost them everything. As they spoke, they heard the dogs barking outside, followed by shouts and running. Something or someone had been discovered. Niccolò had retained a few loyal guards and placed them strategically around their mountain hideaway. He looked at Valeria, his eyes hardening. "Stay here. Lock the door. I will return." He was gone before she could speak. She listened, as sounds grew closer. She could hear Niccolò's voice, raised in anger, and other voices, unfamiliar voices. She had no idea who had discovered them, or what they wanted. Valeria paced the room, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The sounds outside intensified, then faded, then silence. The silence was even more terrifying than the noise, the uncertainty more unbearable than the fear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Niccolò returned. His face was pale, his expression grim, his clothes stained with blood. But it was not his blood. Who was it?" Valeria asked, her voice trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. "Rossi spies," Niccolò replied, his voice cold and hard. "They had found us. They were scouting the area, preparing for another attack." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But they were not alone," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They had someone with them. Someone unexpected." Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. "Who?" she asked, her voice filled with a growing dread. Niccolò hesitated, his expression filled with a mixture of disbelief and pain. "It was Isabella," he said, his voice strained, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. She was with them. She was working with them." The echoes of the past had resurfaced, with a vengeance. Isabella, the woman who had been like a mother to him, the woman who had betrayed him once, had betrayed him again. And this time, her betrayal was even more profound, even more devastating. The past, it seemed, refused to stay buried, its shadows stretching across their present, threatening to consume their future. Chapter 19. The Unbreakable Bonds of Love. The revelation of Isabella's treachery was a devastating blow, particularly to Niccolò. He had trusted her, had loved her like a family member, and her betrayal cut him to the core. He retreated into himself, becoming withdrawn, silent, his usual confidence replaced by a deep, brooding melancholy. Valeria, despite her own shock and dismay, tried to reach him, to offer him comfort, to help him process his pain. She knew that he needed her now more than ever, that their love, their bond, was the only thing that could sustain them through this new crisis. One evening, as they sat together in the farmhouse living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, Valeria gently took Nicolo's hand, her touch a silent offer of support, of understanding. "Nicolo," she said, her voice soft and soothing, "I know this is difficult. I know you are hurting, but you cannot shut me out. We are in this together. We need each other." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a deep regret. I trusted her, Valeria," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I believed in her. And she betrayed me. Again. "I know," Valeria said, her voice filled with empathy. "But you cannot let her betrayal define you. You cannot let her destroy you. You are stronger than that. We are stronger than that." She squeezed his hand, her touch a reassurance, a promise. "We will get through this. Nicolo," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Together, we will face whatever comes. We will not let them win." Her words, her love, her unwavering support seemed to break through his despair, his self-recrimination. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeing the truth, the sincerity, the love in her gaze. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with sobs. Valeria held him, her arms strong and comforting, her presence a source of solace, of strength, of hope. As he cried, he released the pent-up pain, the grief, the anger, the betrayal. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, to be weak, to be human. And in that vulnerability, he found a new strength, a new resolve, a new determination. When the tears finally subsided, he looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear, his expression filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Valeria," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for loving me." He kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of love, of unwavering commitment. The unbreakable bonds of their love had been tested, and they had endured. What do we do now?" Valeria asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart still heavy with the weight of their situation. Nicolo took a deep breath, his expression hardening, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "We fight back, Valeria," he said, his voice firm, his resolve unwavering. "We expose Isabella. We destroy the Rossi family. And we find that treasure." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "The map, Valeria," he said, his voice low and intense. "It is the key. It is our weapon. We will use it to end this, once and for all." They decided to follow the map, to embark on a dangerous quest for the legendary treasure, a quest that would take them into the heart of enemy territory, a quest that would test their courage, their loyalty, their love. They knew the risks, the dangers, the potential for tragedy. But they were prepared to face them, together, united in their purpose, their determination, their unbreakable bond. They would use the past, the legend, the treasure, to forge their future, a future free from violence, from secrets, from the suffocating constraints of their world. They spent the next few days preparing for their journey, gathering supplies, studying the map, planning their route. They were like soldiers preparing for battle, their movements precise and efficient, their focus unwavering, their determination absolute. As they prepared to leave the farmhouse, Nicolo turned to Valeria, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and apprehension. "Are you sure about this, Valeria?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "This is dangerous. We could die." Valeria met his gaze without flinching, her heart filled with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "I am sure, Nicolo," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am with you. Always. Until the end." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. They stood together, on the threshold of a new adventure, a new challenge, a new beginning. The unbreakable bonds of their love were their shield, their weapon, their guiding light. They were ready to face whatever came, together, united in their purpose, their determination, their unwavering commitment to each other. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, a fitting backdrop to their perilous journey, a journey that would test their love, their courage, and their fate. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The journey to the location marked on the map was arduous and fraught with peril. Valeria and Niccolò traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding main roads, relying on their instincts and Niccolò's knowledge of the Sicilian countryside. They faced numerous obstacles, evading Rossi patrols, navigating treacherous terrain, and constantly looking over their shoulders, knowing that they were being hunted. The map led them to an ancient, abandoned monastery, perched high on a cliff overlooking the sea. The monastery was a ruin, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered, its interior filled with dust and debris. It was a place of ghosts, of forgotten memories, of secrets. According to the map, the treasure was hidden somewhere within the monastery walls. Valeria and Niccolò began their search, carefully examining every room, every corridor, every nook and cranny. The atmosphere was heavy with suspense, with anticipation, with the weight of history. As they searched, they spoke little, their focus absolute, their movements precise and efficient. They were like two parts of a single whole, their minds and bodies working in perfect harmony, their love a silent bond that connected them, guided them, sustained them. Finally, after hours of searching, they found it. A hidden chamber, concealed behind a false wall in the monastery's chapel. The chamber was small and dark, its air thick with the smell of dust, and something else, something metallic, something ancient. In the center of the chamber, on a stone pedestal, stood a single object. It was not gold, not jewels, not the glittering treasure they had expected. It was a book. A large, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, its cover adorned with a single, intricate symbol, a serpent coiled around a rose. Valeria and Niccolò looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and understanding. The treasure was not material wealth, but knowledge, wisdom, truth. The book was the diary of the original Valeria, the woman who had been promised to Niccolò's grandfather, the woman who had sparked the centuries-old feud. As they carefully opened the book, the pages crumbling in their hands, they began to read. The diary told a story of love, of betrayal, of sacrifice, of redemption. It revealed the truth about the past, the truth about the original Valeria's choices, the truth about the curse that had haunted their families for generations. The original Valeria had not betrayed Niccolò's grandfather. She had been forced to choose between her love for Alessandro and her duty to her family. She had chosen love, but she had also made a sacrifice. She had hidden a secret that would protect her family, a secret that would end the feud. The secret was not a treasure, but a truth about the Rossi family, a truth about their origins, a truth about their illegitimacy. The Rossi family, it turned out, were not descendants of the original Rossi patriarch, but of a bastard child, a child born of a forbidden union, a child who had no claim to the Rossi name, to the Rossi power, to the Rossi legacy. The original Valeria had hidden this truth, hoping that it would one day be revealed, hoping that it would end the cycle of violence, hoping that it would bring peace. As Valeria and Niccolò read the final pages of the diary, they heard a noise behind them. They turned to see Isabella standing in the doorway of the chamber, a gun in her hand, her face a mask of hatred and desperation. "So," she said, her voice cold and hard, "you found it. The treasure. The truth." She raised the gun, aiming it at Valeria. "But it will do you no good," she said, her voice filled with a venomous rage. "The truth dies with you." Before Isabella could pull the trigger, Niccolò stepped in front of Valeria, shielding her with his body, his eyes filled with a fierce determination, a love that defied death. "Isabella," he said, his voice calm but firm, "put down the gun. It is over." Isabella laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "It is never over, Niccolò," she said, her voice dripping with hatred. "Not until you are dead. Not until the Moretti name is extinguished." She fired the gun. But before the bullet could reach Niccolò, another figure stepped into the chamber. It was Don Angelo Rossi, the head of the Rossi family, his face pale, his expression horrified. He had followed them, had tracked them to the monastery, hoping to claim the treasure for himself. But he had also overheard their conversation, had heard the truth revealed in the original Valeria's diary. He grabbed Isabella's arm, forcing her to lower the gun.
No,
He shouted, his voice filled with anguish. This cannot be. It is a lie. Niccolò seized the opportunity. He lunged at Isabella, disarming her, his movements swift and practiced. A struggle ensued, a brief, violent clash, but Niccolò, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to protect Valeria, quickly overpowered her. Don Angelo Rossi, his world collapsing around him, his legacy shattered, his power gone, sank to his knees, his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. The truth had been revealed, and it had destroyed him. Valeria rushed to Niccolò's side, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes filled with relief and love. They embraced, their bodies trembling, their hearts overflowing with a gratitude that defied words. The final confrontation had come, and they had survived. The hearts and loyalties of all involved had been tested, and the truth had prevailed. The treasure had been found, not gold or jewels, but knowledge, wisdom, and the power to break a centuries-old curse. The cycle of violence, of betrayal, of revenge, had finally been broken. The past had been laid to rest, and the future, a future filled with hope, with love, with peace, was finally within their reach. As the sun set over the ancient monastery, casting long shadows across the ruined walls, Valeria and Niccolò stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts intertwined, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world that had been consumed by darkness for far too long. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of transformation. Niccolò, with Valeria by his side, initiated a series of reforms within the Moretti family, moving away from the traditional, violent methods of the past, embracing a new era of legitimacy and cooperation. He used the truth revealed in the original Valeria's diary to negotiate a lasting peace with the remaining members of the Rossi family, a peace based on mutual respect, on shared interests, on a common desire to leave the darkness behind. Isabella was handed over to the authorities, her crimes exposed, her reign of terror brought to an end. She died alone and unmourned. Niccolò and Valeria left Sicily, leaving behind the world of the Mafia, the world of violence and secrets, the world that had both defined and threatened to destroy them. They settled in a small, quiet village in Tuscany, surrounded by rolling hills, vineyards, and olive groves. They bought a small farmhouse, restoring it with their own hands, transforming it into a home, a sanctuary, a place of peace and love. Valeria returned to her painting, her art flourishing in this new, idyllic setting. Her canvases were filled with light, with color, with the beauty of the Tuscan landscape. Niccolò, freed from the burdens of his past, discovered a new passion: winemaking. He learned the ancient craft, tending the vines, harvesting the grapes, creating wines that were a testament to the land, to the sun, to the life he had finally found. They lived a simple life, a quiet life, a life filled with love, with laughter, with the simple joys of everyday existence. They had found their paradise, their sanctuary, their happily ever after. One warm summer evening, as they sat together on their terrace, watching the sun set over the Tuscan hills, painting the sky in shades of orange, purple, and gold, Valeria turned to Niccolò, her eyes filled with a love that had endured, a love that had triumphed, a love that had transformed them both. "Do you ever regret it, Niccolò?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. "Do you ever miss your old life, your power, your influence?" He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of contentment, of peace, of love. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Never, Valeria," he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "I have everything I ever wanted, right here. I have you." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss, a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that spoke of a love that had conquered all, a love that would last forever. The Tuscan landscape, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, was a testament to their new beginning, a symbol of their enduring love, a promise of a future filled with peace, with happiness, with the simple joys of a life well lived, a life well loved. They had found their happily ever after, not in a palace of power, but in a simple farmhouse, surrounded by beauty,